Hello, welcome to the Let's Talk Kids Health Facebook Live Show, episode 26. I'm Dr. Narissa Bauer, your host. I'm a behavioral pediatrician and blogger of Let's Talk Kids Health. As you know, the concept of this show is to share information about behavioral health, parenting, and family wellness. Each week, I plan to bring you topics and guests to help me advance this mission so that we can all talk together. Now, remember, if you're watching this live, you'll have the opportunity to post comments or ask questions of my guest. Let us know that you're here by dropping a comment, giving us a like, and using hashtag live. The replay will be immediately available after the broadcast. And if you're watching the show and you're like, hey, so and so would really benefit from this episode, please share because sharing is caring. And if you don't want to miss future episodes or maybe check out some of the past ones, please subscribe to my YouTube channel, Narissa Bauer MD, and follow my blog Facebook page, Let's Talk Kids Health. Okay, so now let's get on to this week's guest. Let's welcome Dr. Gabriella Rodriguez. Dr. Rodriguez is a clinical child psychologist and assistant professor at Indiana University School of Medicine. She is the co-director of the ADHD Disruptive Behavior Disorders program at Riley Hospital for Children here in Indianapolis, Indiana. Her passions are working with parents and caregivers to develop effective behavior management strategies for their young children. Dr. Gabby Rodriguez, thank you so much for joining us today. I am so excited to reconnect with you.
Same here. Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, so, before we jump into the questions, I'm just curious if you could share for those who are watching or listening, why did you decide to become a clinical psychologist?
Yeah, great question. I actually always kind of knew this was going to be the thing that I wanted to do. So I think probably starting in high school, I took a psychology course, 2 psychology courses, and I just thought it was so fascinating. And then I learned more and more about the things that we can do to help young kids be successful and be happy and all of those things. And I just knew that's what I needed to do. So ever since high school, that's been my purpose.
Oh, well, and I bet your parents are proud. So,
Yes, I think so.
yeah. Well, as you know, there are so many, um, kids out there that are in need of your services. If it's anything like what I'm seeing, there are a lot of children, a lot of families experiencing a lot of stress, especially with the fact that we're going to be going back to school. Oh no, in a few weeks.
Yep.
And just everything that we've been living through. And so that's why I was really excited to have you on the show, especially because, parenting it can be challenging at times. And so I will just start with this first question. I'd like to get your take on what makes parenting effective, and I put that in quotes. So
Yeah, effective probably has a lot of definitions to different people, right?
yes.
I think one of the things that I think about when I think about effective parenting is parenting that's a combination of a lot of warmth and responsiveness and really being kind of present and having a really strong relationship with your child, and also lots of structure and consistency and making sure that kids know that the rules are going to be the rules. They're not going to change too much. Routines are really consistent across time, and parents are always going to be there for them. And so I think that combination of having lots of warmth and structure can be a really at least that's what I think about when I think about really effective parenting.
Yeah, I do too. And I like how you said that. It's that balance between those two things. I mean, what sort of advice do you have for parents? Like you just said that, and they're like, "Oh, it sounds so easy." Right? But
Yep.
like in life is hard and we're tired, we're stressed ourselves. Like, so I'm going to throw up this next question. Like, what can parents do when they feel frustrated by their kids' behavior?
I think a few things. I think the first thing I would say, and this is what I say to the parents that I work with, is it's okay. It's okay to feel frustrated by your child's behavior. Just because they're your child and you love them very much doesn't mean that there's not going to be times when their behavior is frustrating, right? So I think first, just accept that it's okay. It doesn't make me a bad parent to feel frustrated by my child's behavior. It just makes me a parent. It's just part of the ball game. The other thing that I think is important to think about when parents are feeling really frustrated is that behavior is communication. And so if we're seeing a behavior that's a problem over and over again, and it's kind of become a pattern, I think it's important for parents to start to think about, okay, what's going on here? What's my child trying to communicate to me through this behavior? And one of my favorite things to do when we're trying to figure out what's going on with a particular behavior, what are some of the things that this kiddo is trying to communicate, is to look at the ABCs. Do you use the ABCs in your clinic?
I absolutely do.
Yes.
But
So
let's
the
talk
ABCs,
about that.
yeah, I love the ABCs. So the ABCs, so the A stands for antecedent, which is just a big word for anything that happens right before a behavior that we see. The B, of course, is behavior. And then the C is consequence, which for us really isn't just a negative consequence, right? So getting a lollipop can be just as much of a consequence as being placed in timeout. It's just anything that happens after a behavior. And so when parents are feeling frustrated by something, oftentimes I'll say, okay, let's break it down. Let's look at the ABCs. What happens before? What's the behavior looking like? What's happening after? And if we can look at that over time and find some patterns, it kind of helps us figure out what's going on here. So a really common example is, we are at the grocery store, let's say, and a kiddo is, the checkout line is a very challenging place to be. There's lots of really cool stuff, and kiddo wants something, a candy bar, some gum, whatever the case might be. And so that's our antecedent, right? We're at the checkout line, kid wants something, parent says no. Then what happens? Usually a tantrum, right? Especially with the younger ones. So we might see a tantrum, some screaming, some yelling, asking why over and over again, those types of things. And then sometimes the consequence is parents give in, right? And that's pretty common, right? I don't think parents should feel bad about that because it happens, right? Especially when we're in a stressful situation like the grocery store. But if we look at the ABCs of that, right? Kid wants something, is told no, kid has a tantrum, consequences, kid ends up getting the thing that, kiddo wanted, then most likely we're going to see those tantrums happening more frequently, right? And so once we look at those ABCs, we can start to figure out, okay, what was going on here and what can we do about it? So oftentimes in a situation like that, I might talk with parents about setting up a system in advance, right? So being kind of proactive and planning for something like at the grocery store, you can get one thing, right? Or maybe the parent brings something that kiddo can earn if they show us some appropriate behavior. So just by looking at that pattern, we're able to figure out one way that in the future we can try to prevent that type of kind of frustrating behavior.
Yeah, I love that framework. And, I use that a lot in my clinic too. I actually have them document or track that. It just helps us understand the trends, as you said, to really understanding then how we can tweak things.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I love that. And I should mention, because as we're talking, I'm starting to see a couple comments coming up. Oh, just a comment here from Brittany. I 100% given more than I should.
Good
Brittany,
stuff.
you are not alone.
Nope, not alone.
Been there, done that.
Yep.
Right? Yeah, so I should say, for those of you watching right now, if you're starting to get some juicy questions, go ahead and type it in the comments and I'll be able to sort of see it and bring it up to our guest in a little bit. So we're going to keep going here. So I love that. The ABCs of behavior, documenting. Now, how do you help a parent wade through that? Because obviously, it's not just one thing that they usually have concerns about. How do you work with a family to kind of think through how to prioritize?
Yeah, I think that's that's a really good point, right? Because a lot of times, I'll meet a family and there's lots of different things that are going on. And it doesn't mean that we can't tackle all of them, but if you try to tackle them all at once, it's going to be too hard, right?
Yep.
Nobody can do this. Parenting is hard enough as it is. If we're trying to tackle tons of different behaviors at the same time, it's just not going to be feasible for most people. So I usually try to think about at the start, what is the one or two things that could make the biggest difference in your day-to-day life? If this behavior were to improve, what would things look like? Would your day be calmer? Would there be less chaos in your home, right? How would you feel when you go to bed at night? And so kind of asking yourself those questions can help you figure out what are really the top priorities here, right? What's having the biggest impact? And I think sometimes that alone can be a really big kind of weight off your shoulders, right? It's not, I have to tackle 5, 10 things. I'm just going to focus on this one thing right now. We're going to see how that goes. And then over time, right, we can kind of get to those other ones, in the future, but not all at once.
Right, right. And I love that. So again, Brittany says one at a time. Love that. And then, oh, great. Dr. Almas is watching. So she says, oftentimes kids are overwhelmed at big supermarkets and get overstimulated. Helping them by giving them a job or something to focus on may also help. Thank you for that tip.
I love that. That's a really great idea.
Yes, yes, for sure. I love this interaction, guys. Keep it coming. Um, yeah, so ABCs of behavior. And I always like when I talk to families too, and I love how you sort of help think through that with the families that you're seeing. Like, how do we prioritize? What's like the low-hanging fruit that we can work on, get you a win, give you confidence, right? And then also help your child feel like, oh, okay, now I'm getting it, right? And then build on that, right? And so I think that's going to be really, really important to do. But knowing that you can't tackle everything all at once, because, if you're going to try to change a behavior, you've got to be kind to yourself too, because you got to like use some mental energy to do it rather than just falling back on those patterns of behavior. So this is the big one, and I'm assuming that we're going to get some more questions, comments, but tips for parents to manage common behavior concerns. I mean, like, do you find yourself giving the same types of advice? Like maybe we could start there. What are some of the common things that you tell families? Or do you want to start with like a specific example?
Yeah, I think I can talk about some of the common things because there are definitely general strategies that we can do pretty quickly that oftentimes will help us across a range of different things. One of the things that I think is often really helpful for families who are struggling with kids not following directions, or just, parents come to me and they say, I just have to tell them to do this thing like 5 times, 10 times, like over and over all day long. And that's really frustrating because there's a lot of things that we need kids to do in a day. And so one of the things that I think is most helpful for families is just using routines and reward systems. So rather than having, every step of the morning routine be something that mom or dad has to think about and then tell the kiddo to do and then repeat it a bunch of times, let's put it on paper. Let's make a checklist. Let's make it fun, right? Maybe we can decorate it with unicorns or whatever the case might be that kiddo's really into, and some pictures of what are all the different, kind of steps to the routine. And then maybe there's a reward for getting it done, right? So that there's a little bit of more motivation for the kid at the end. And then the checklist also can serve to remove the parent a little bit, right? So it's not mom or dad having to constantly repeat. We can kind of use the chart as like wait, let's see what's next. What are you supposed to do? So it can make it a little bit more fun. And then again, it also builds some independence, right? So little kids, of course, are going to need lots of support getting through the day and reminders and things like that. But with something like this, as they get older, they can start to take charge a little bit more and have a little more choice, which we know can help kids be more motivated to listen, right? If they have a couple of choices built in here or there. So that's one thing that I think is, generally speaking, really helpful for a lot of families I work with.
Yeah, so just to recap, because there was so much in there right now. So just as you talked about visual cues, like a visual schedule, which I love, and also sort of promoting independence. And again, parents get really frustrated if they're constantly having to be on their child and tell them again and again what they want. So giving them some ability to refer back to something makes it very simple for the child, meets them where they are, but at the same time keeps you like one step removed. But you can then be a cheerleader rather than kind of engineering the whole process, right? Because I love what you just said about like allowing your child to sort of do that so you can actually see what they can accomplish. Yeah, and then rewards. Let's talk about that because you talked about rewards. Do you normally advocate for that? Because I can imagine that there are going to be some listeners, watchers are like, I like what kind of rewards? Like, do I have to give them something every time they're supposed to fix their bed?
Right. Yeah, I get that question all the time. And I think, there's this kind of fundamental thing that we think about with rewards. It's like, well, why should I reward you for the things that you're supposed to do, right? Like you're supposed to do your homework, you're supposed to pick up your toys. And I generally think about how, yes, they are, but it's kind of like our jobs, right? Like most of the time we go to work and we get paid. And there's something at the end of it for us, right? Like I love my job and I would do it probably for free, but I think it's like maybe not a good example myself. But I think generally speaking, right, we do things and there's an outcome that comes with it. And sometimes for kids, they just don't really get the outcome that we're thinking about. So we may think, well, you do your homework, you're going to get good grades, you're going to experience this, feeling of success. But for kids, that might just be too far away. It's just not immediate enough for little kids. And so if we put in a reward kind of to encourage that behavior, not only are we likely to see more of it, but over time, then kids will have the opportunity to actually see, oh, wait a minute, I did this, right? I put in some effort and I had a really good outcome. But if they're not doing it, they're not going to have the opportunity to see that, right? So yeah. I think that for me, rewards is definitely something that I really advocate for in my clinic. And then in terms of what types of rewards, it's not going to be a trip to Disney World every time that you make your bed. I like to think about what are some of the things that kids are already getting as part of their day that are pretty cool and pretty fun. And how can we build that into something that kids now have to earn for doing the things that they're kind of supposed to do throughout the day? So really anything that a kiddo enjoys can be used as a reward or as a motivator. I think a classic one is, stickers for really little ones. They love them. We can get them to do lots of the stuff that they should do with a sticker, or sometimes it's like extra time doing something, extra time with a particular activity, extra time riding your bike, extra time before bedtime, things like that. So oftentimes the typical day-to-day type fun things are the most effective rewards because they're the most likely to stick. If we are saying every single time that you do something, you're going to get, something really extravagant, like maybe not extravagant, but, I'm not going to take you to get ice cream every single time you do your homework. It's just not realistic. And so thinking about those day-to-day things, I think can make it more likely for families to continue to use them across time.
Yeah, I love that. So in my parenting groups that I used to run before COVID, we talked a lot about and brainstormed like examples of low cost, no cost rewards. This is kind of the example that you said. And, I think sometimes parents forget that kids really just want our attention too. So not to discount that, like an extra story at bedtime, right? Or, getting to sit in dad's chair for dinner.
That's really special.
Right. But yeah, I love that. And so what do you say, Gabby, when parents are like, well, fine, I can do that, but like, what if then my child thinks that I have to reward them every time they do something? Like, that's not going to be good either.
Right, absolutely. And I think that's tricky, right? Because if we do a reward for every single thing, then yeah, that's what kids are going to learn to expect, right? So I think the trick is to make sure we're establishing everything in advance, right? So it's kind of the difference between rewards and bribes, right? So rewards are something that the parent is in charge of, and the parent is establishing in advance and letting kids know this is how it's going to go. You're going to do this behavior and this will be your reward, rather than kids turning it around and saying, oh, I'll do this if you give me XYZ. Right? We're not going to go into that territory because then we can get into that really transactional situation. The other thing is that, initially we do want to reward behaviors, especially new behaviors, really frequently because we want to get them going. But over time, once kids are kind of consistently doing the thing we want them to do, then we don't need to reward them every single time, right? Then we kind of fade it out a little bit and it's like, okay, you're going to do, make your bed 3 days in a row. Then you get whatever the reward might be. And so if we fade the rewards over time, we're less likely to experience that like kids demanding a reward before they're going to do something.
Yeah. And that's really important. I love that you talked about that, sort of the spacing of it and monitoring their kind of their ability to carry out that, and then and reminding them like, oh my gosh, that is so easy for you. I wonder if you could now fix your bed 3 days in a row, right?
Yeah, yeah.
Before we do it. I think you can, but let's just see. I mean, just you could be playful about it, right? Because you want
Absolutely.
to make sure that they still have their buy-in and all of that. So I love what you said. So brainstorming with them, potentially what they can earn. And what about like the kids that are like, "Mommy, I want this," like a sticker, but
Mhm.
then they're like, "No, I don't want that anymore."
Yeah, that happens a lot, especially for little kids, right? Because
Yep.
there's so many things and they're so exciting and we change a lot from one to another. So I think it's really important to keep rewards fresh and exciting. If it's not
Mhm.
exciting, it's not going to be an effective reward. So there's a couple ways we could do this. One of them is to do more of like a reward menu. So there's a few kind of, established options that are on the reward menu, and kid can choose whichever one they're most interested in that day. Or we can just switch them up, right? If we're not going to make all of the rewards available at once in a menu, we could just say, okay, this week, what's going to be your reward? Next week, what's going to be your reward, right? And kind of thinking about it in that way, and maybe doing a little bit of a rotation.
Mhm.
But I think that's really important because a lot of times families will talk to me about reward systems that they've used in the past, and they'll say, oh yeah, it really worked well at first, and then I don't know, over time it just kind of stopped working. And that's often one of the most common reasons that happens, is that the reward just gets kind of boring after a while, and so we need to freshen things up a little bit.
And I really love, I mean, I use that same analogy, like, as parents, when we do work, we get paid,
Hmm.
right? So we're teaching our children life skills. And, parents understand that, right? So, but oftentimes I don't know what you tell families about this scenario, but like if the child doesn't do what they're supposed to do, is
Hmm.
it ever okay to take away something, right?
Yeah.
So what do you say to that
Yeah, I think
in
it's
general?
entirely appropriate, right? Because ultimately there are going to be things that we need kids to do. And
Hmm.
so if a reward isn't enough, we do often have to use, another consequence strategy for,
Right.
if kids are not following the direction. I think one of the important things with using privilege removal, for example, as a consequence, is to think about it beforehand. So kind of have in your mind a list of, okay, these are some of the things that I'm going to consider taking away. Sometimes in the heat of the moment, if we're really frustrated and we've given the direction, 5, 10 times, we might shout out a privilege removal that then we're like, oh no, like that might not be so good for me either, right? Like, oh, now we're not going to go on vacation, or we're not going to go to the park. And it's like, well, actually, we probably need to go to the park because that's going to be the best for the whole family. And so making sure that we think about what are the privilege removal options in advance, which
Mm-hmm.
ones am I really truly willing to stick to,
Mm-hmm.
and then only using those. And then, of course, making them age appropriate, right? I mean, especially little kids, if you remove something for more than a day, they're probably not going to remember what that thing was the next day, right? So thinking about the time, the amount of time that the privilege goes away, and making that be kind of appropriate, age appropriate, so that it doesn't, so that it just is more effective. And it also gives you something else to try the next time that you need to give them a direction, right? If you take something away for a week, what are you going to do tomorrow when there's another direction and we might have to use some privilege removal? So
Yeah.
thinking about those things in advance, I think, can be really useful for parents.
Yeah, and so what you just said is really important. It's going into this, talking to your child about sort of the system, getting
Hmm.
their buy-in, even having even mentioned like having them make the chart, or kind
Hmm.
of all of that, thinking through what those rewards could potentially be. And then also talking with your partner about like, okay, if this doesn't happen or if this happens, then what are the other consequences, and how are we going to respond? The key here is to pre-plan as much
Yes,
as possible and not just kind of
absolutely.
wing it. Yeah.
Yes, the more proactive, the better, because that really encourages that consistency, right? And when there's inconsistency, even within one parent, there could be inconsistency, right? But definitely if there's more than one caregiver in the mix, And kids push boundaries when there's inconsistency because they're like, wait a minute, let me see what I can get away with. And so the more consistent we can be across time and across, multiple caregivers, the less likely that we're going to see that type of like boundary pushing behavior.
So I'm waiting to see if there are any other questions, but let me go ahead and just ask another question in terms
Yeah.
of like, we're talking about reward systems here. What are some of the common things that you prescribe or talk with families about in terms of how to prevent behavior problems? Are there specific
Mhm.
strategies that you advocate for or talk with families about?
Yeah. So I think, going back to those ABCs, one of the things that families can often do is look for those patterns, right? Is my kid more likely to have a tantrum when they're probably tired or hungry or all of those things, right? And then figuring out what can I do to prevent that situation. I think the grocery store example that was given earlier is a really good one because we know that's an environment that's likely to be really overstimulating, lots of things going on. So I can try to prevent some of this problem behavior by assigning my kids something to do, right? Telling them what to do instead of waiting until they do something that they're not supposed to do and then reacting to that, right? So I think that those proactive strategies are really useful. And then in general, I think one thing that everybody can be doing with their kids is doing some one-on-one time. We know that the more kids are getting consistent, warm, positive attention from their parents, the less likely problem behaviors are going to happen because kids are not going to be doing things to try to get attention, right? If they're getting it on a regular basis. So that's another really great preventative strategy, I think.
Yeah, I love that. And, it reminds me when my kids were little, they're not little anymore, but when they were little, I would give them their own grocery list. Sometimes with a
Oh, I
picture
love
on
that.
it, just a couple items, but then they'd have to go and look for it at the store. So that was a nice way to sort of keep them involved and have us talking about what we're doing and getting involved in that. My daughter absolutely loved weighing things, the produce.
Oh, fun.
So that was her job.
Nice.
Um, so here's a question. Thank you for this question, Dr. Almas. Like, what is your approach to sibling rivalry? That is a huge one all the time.
Yeah, this is a really tough one because it's just so common, right? We're often seeing kids, and siblings just kind of duking it out over lots of even sometimes really small things.
Yes.
I think, I like to use the one-on-one time approach kind of for siblings too, and trying to help, as a parent, be the one who's kind of a facilitator, but not too involved, right? So thinking about what's something that my two kiddos might have in common and might really enjoy doing together, and how can I kind of very very quietly facilitate or foster those types of things happening so that they really have some opportunities to have fun times together where they're not really kind of competing. We don't want it to be something that's like super competitive or things like that, but just ways that they can spend positive time together that hopefully will extend to other times in the day.
Mm-hmm.
The other thing, and I think this happened a lot last year when folks were home all of the time, it's sometimes we need space from the people that we love, right? And that's okay. It doesn't mean that you don't love your sibling. It just means if we're together all the time, constantly, that's really hard to manage for anybody, right? So having opportunities that are kind of built into the schedule for some kind of alone time for kids to do their own thing, maybe a little bit, some time away from their sibling. I think, it's like distance makes the heart grow fonder, right? So maybe if I spend a couple hours away from my sibling, I might be more excited to see them and hang out with them when I get to see them again. So that's just kind of one approach, but I'd love to hear if others have ideas because this is something that happens very, very frequently.
Yeah, and I do a free parenting book club, and one of the, I'm sure you know this book, Siblings Without Rivalry. We read this one back in January, I believe, of this year. It's really one of my go-to books that I suggest to families to read. And there's just so many nuggets in there. I read it again and again periodically, and I'm like, oh, that's a good one. I need to remember that. But one of the big ones is, if your child, this happened a lot in our household, where one child would be like, Mom, he did this or she did that, or so, always kind of drawing attention, trying to be focused on the child at hand, meeting them and giving them the attention they need, and saying, I understand that that's really frustrating, empathizing with that particular child, but what do you need right now? I will take
Mhm.
care of this. I'll take care of, so and so in a little bit, but let me focus on you right now. So that way, again, giving your child that individual one-on-one time. Because
Mhm.
sometimes the other kids are sort of saying that because they want, attention, this
Yeah,
way.
yeah.
So it's really hard though to balance that sibling rivalry because there's this notion that everything has to be equal, or you give him more than this, and you love him more than me, right? But
Mhm.
that book is really helpful. I think it gives you a lot of really good communication tips and strategies too, ways to think about it.
Great. I'm definitely gonna borrow that.
Yes, we're dealing with that in our home right now. Yeah. And then thanks for the feedback. So helpful. Yeah. So, I mean, I think one of the big takeaways that I'm hearing from what you just provided us. Thank you so much, by the way, for just sharing a lot of your expertise and, what you share with families who get to see you.
Thank you.
It sounds to me thinking about the ABCs is going to be the biggest thing. Like that's going to be your
Mhm.
starting point. So right now, if you're waiting to see a pediatrician or a psychologist or a different type of specialist, and you're one of those families that are like struggling right now, that's one of the things that I would suggest
Mhm.
that Dr. Gabby has said, kind of tracking those ABCs. Again, reminder, A is antecedent, B is what does that behavior look like? I also like to know, like, is the tantrum a breath holding spell? Are they throwing things? Are they
Mhm.
kicking? And how
Yep.
long does it last? Who does it occur with? Where does it occur? Like
Mhm.
those kinds of notes. And then see the consequence, like how do you respond? And what's working and what's not worked,
Right.
because that also helps us kind of figure that out. So if, if
Mhm.
if if you're really struggling, just try to do those quick notes, or if you don't want to write it down, voice memo it. That's totally fine too.
Yep.
Sometimes parents like to record, and sometimes that can like make things worse, though. Especially if a kid's already in tantrum and then crying, and then they see you video recording. So I use that one with caution. Um,
Mhm.
but, I mean, I think it's just really helpful to start gathering that information. If you're concerned, talking to your child's daycare provider, teachers, gathering some of that information. So that way, when you do have face to face time with someone, you can share that information and you guys can start thinking through that. And I love your approach to prevention, as well as, some of that positive rewards to foster autonomy. So gosh, there's so much. I mean, we could talk about this for days, I'm
Yep.
sure. But I do want to thank you for your time, because it is 8 o'clock. So I just want to wrap it up. I'm not seeing any more questions currently, but if you have any more questions or you're watching this on replay, make sure to use hashtag replay when you drop a question, and then that will flag it for me. So that way I can then try to answer myself and or ask Dr. Gabby to weigh in
Sounds good.
on these questions. So again, thank you so much for joining the show, Dr. Gabby. And
Thank you for
again,
having
I
me.
know
This
this
was
is so
great.
great. I mean, those of you who have been here with me from the beginning know that I kind of started this not just because I want to help get this information out, but I love reconnecting with the folks that I used to work with, like Dr. Gabby, but also like just getting this information out there because I think it's so important for us as a society to be able to break down the stigma around behavioral health, parenting, and gosh, nobody's perfect. Like we've
Nope.
all been there. So I want parents to feel able and confident to like talk about it, right? So thank you so much for encouraging and being part of this conversation. And then if you have any suggestions for those of you watching, if you have suggestions for future topics or guests, please feel free to reach out to me at Dr. Narissa at letstalkkidshealth.org, or just leave a comment below on any of my social media platforms. And remember, consider subscribing to my YouTube channel, Narissa Bauer MD, to be alerted each week when I go live. Again, it was a pleasure talking with you, Dr. Gabby.
Thank you.
And I will, let me just I don't think I announced my next week's guest here. So, my next guest is going to be Stephanie Whiteside, who will be talking to us about school mental health supports. I will tell
Excellent.
you, yeah, this is a huge topic, right? I mean, we're getting ready, oh no, to start school here in a few weeks. So, I'm so glad to have Stephanie on the show. I will say it was pre recorded, but you will still be able to ask questions next week. All right. Well, that's that's it. Have a good night, and we'll see you all soon.